In the first week of the Iran war, Emirates Airlines has lost an estimated $600 million in revenue. Widely regarded as the world's most premium airline, Emirates now has aircraft stranded across the globe, thousands of transit passengers trapped in airports, and almost 90% of its flights cancelled. And all because of a few invisible lines in the sky. Take Emirates flight EK132, a routine service between Moscow and Dubai. Under normal conditions, the aircraft flies almost directly south across Russia, crosses Iranian airspace, and lands in Dubai roughly 5 hours later. But when Iranian airspace suddenly closed, that route became impossible. Instead of flying straight south, the aircraft now has to swing far across Eastern Europe before bending back towards the Gulf, stretching that journey to almost 7 hours. Multiply that disruption across an airline built entirely around connecting flights through Dubai, and the result is catastrophic. So how could Emirates collapse so badly in such a short amount of time? How did geography, once the airline's greatest strength, suddenly become its greatest weakness? And more importantly, can Emirates survive the Middle East airspace collapse? So to understand why Emirates has been hit so hard, you first have to understand what actually happened in the skies over the Middle East. At the end of February, a sudden escalation in the conflict between Israel and Iran triggered one of the fastest airspace shutdowns the region has ever seen. I covered the entire collapse in detail in another video, so if you want the full breakdown, you can watch that next, but I'll give you the short version here. At 6 AM GMT, joint US-Israeli strikes began. Within minutes, both Israel and Iran shut their flight information regions, immediately cutting off one of the most direct aviation corridors between Europe and India. By 9 AM, the closures began spreading across the region. Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon all suspended civilian overflights, removing the primary northern route used by hundreds of long-haul aircraft travelling between Europe and the Persian Gulf. By 10 AM, the disruption escalated again. Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait closed their airspace entirely, while the UAE introduced partial restrictions. Dubai International Airport, the busiest international hub on Earth, temporarily halted arrivals and departures. Individually, none of these closures would normally cripple global aviation. Airlines deal with restricted airspace all the time. Flights reroute around storms, military exercises, and temporary conflicts on a near-daily basis. But this situation was different. Because when we plot these closures on a map, they don't just create isolated no-fly zones. They form something much more dangerous to the global airline network, a continuous barrier. Stretching from the Mediterranean all the way to the Persian Gulf, the restricted airspace effectively seals off the narrow corridor that normally connects Europe and Asia. And that corridor is one of the busiest pieces of sky on the entire planet. On any normal day, thousands of long-haul flights pass through this region, carrying passengers between Europe, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, and East Asia. For airlines, it's the most direct and efficient bridge between the western and eastern halves of the world. When that bridge closed, aircraft only had two options. They could divert thousands of kilometers north, flying over the Caucasus and Central Asia. Or they could swing far to the south, routing across Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Sea. Both options add hours to already long flights. And for many routes, that delay simply isn't possible. Aircraft have strict limits on fuel, payload, and crew duty time. Push those limits too far and the flight becomes economically or even physically impossible to operate. So instead of rerouting, airlines began cancelling flights entirely. And no airline felt that shock faster than the one sitting directly in the middle of it all: Emirates. If you enjoy deep dives into aviation, infrastructure, and global transport systems like this, consider subscribing. I'm trying to get to 10,000 subscribers, and I post new breakdowns every week. The same geography that made Dubai the perfect global hub for decades suddenly turned it into one of the most isolated airports in the world. A serious problem for an airline built around some of the largest aircraft ever put into commercial service. Emirates operates 116 Airbus A380s, that's the largest fleet of the double-decker Super Jumbo anywhere on Earth. These aircraft burn roughly 11 to 12 tons of jet fuel every hour they fly, which means when flights suddenly become longer, the economics can change very quickly. But when the Middle East airspace closures began, airlines attempted to route around the problem. Flights like Emirates EK132, which normally take about 5 hours between Moscow and Dubai, suddenly stretched closer to 7. And those extra hours came with a steep penalty. At typical cruise burn rates, an additional 2 hours of flight time requires loading around 24 extra tons of fuel before departure. But these aircraft can't simply carry unlimited fuel. Each plane has a maximum takeoff weight, and adding fuel means removing something else, usually payload. Cargo pallets come off, seats are left empty, and baggage loads are reduced, which creates a brutal economic paradox. At current jet fuel prices, those additional 24 tons can easily cost $20,000 to $25,000 per flight. So Emirates suddenly found itself paying tens of thousands of dollars more in fuel for every flight, while simultaneously being forced to carry less revenue on board. Multiply that penalty across dozens, sometimes hundreds of long-haul flights every day, and the additional fuel bill alone quickly climbs into the millions of dollars every day. And that was only the first phase of the crisis. Because as the closures spread across the Middle East, detours stopped being viable altogether. Flights were cancelled, aircraft were grounded, and the economics of the situation became far more severe. Emirates normally generates roughly $33 billion in annual revenue, which works out to about $90 million every single day. When flights stop operating, that revenue disappears almost instantly, but the costs don't. Aircraft leases still have to be paid, maintenance schedules still continue, and salaries for more than 100,000 employees still need to be covered. Every day the network remains disrupted, the airline continues burning money. After just the first week, the estimated losses had already passed $600 million. But the financial damage was only one part of the crisis, because at the centre of the entire system, Dubai International Airport, something else was starting to break down. Under normal conditions, Dubai International runs with extraordinary efficiency. The airport handles more than 440,000 aircraft movements every year, making it one of the busiest aviation hubs on Earth. But what makes Dubai work is not just scale, it's timing. The entire airport is built around a system known as connecting banks. Aircraft from across Europe, Africa and Asia arrive in tightly coordinated waves, unload passengers, swap crews, refuel and depart again within a short window of time. In less than 2 hours, tens of thousands of passengers can move through the terminal, connecting between flights that were never meant to originate or end in Dubai at all. It's a system designed for continuous flow, not storage. But when flights began arriving hours late or not arriving at all, that choreography started to collapse. Dubai simply doesn't have the space to park its entire fleet. Emirates alone operates more than 250 wide-body aircraft, yet DXB only has a limited number of gates and remote stands capable of handling them. The airport was designed under the assumption that aircraft would be constantly moving, landing, unloading, refueling, and departing again. When that flow stopped, the entire airport backed up almost immediately. Aircraft that should have been turning around in under an hour were instead sitting on taxiways, waiting for gates that never freed up. Within hours, the airport's concrete surfaces began to fill with grounded aircraft. Within hours, that disruption spills out of the airport and into the city itself. With thousands of transit passengers suddenly unable to continue their journeys, Dubai's hotels began to fill rapidly. Estimates suggest that more than 20,000 connecting passengers were stranded in the first wave of cancellations alone. What had been designed as the world's most efficient connecting hub was suddenly functioning as something very different, an increasingly expensive parking lot for aircraft that could no longer reach half their destinations. And that raises some larger questions about the future of Dubai's aviation strategy. Because just 40 kilometers south of Dubai International, the city is already building its successor. The project is called Dubai Al Maktoum International Airport, more commonly known as Dubai World Central or DWC. And in terms of scale, it's unlike anything aviation has ever attempted. The airport sits on a site covering roughly 70 square kilometers, larger than many entire cities. Current plans call for 5 parallel runways, more than 400 aircraft gates, and a passenger capacity that could eventually reach 260 million travellers per year. That's more than double the size of today's largest airports. Dubai has already committed around $35 billion to the project, with long-term plans to eventually shift operations away from Dubai International entirely. If the current roadmap holds, DWC could become the city's primary aviation hub sometime in the early 2030s. And if you want to understand just how enormous that project is, and the insane logistics required to build it, we broke the entire plan down in detail in another video. But the reason DWC matters here isn't just scale. It represents an ultimate version of the strategy that made Emirates successful in the first place. building the largest connecting hub on Earth, funnel passengers from every continent into one central point, and use massive long-haul aircraft to redistribute them across the world. But the crisis unfolding in the Middle Eastern airspace exposes a dangerous weakness in that model, because the entire concept only works if aircraft can actually reach the hub. If the airspace around the Gulf becomes politically unstable, fragmented, or frequently restricted, the very geography that once made Dubai powerful begins to work against it. A mega hub only functions when the sky around it is open, which raises a difficult strategic question. What happens if the global aviation network becomes too fractured to reliably reach the world's largest airport? Because if that happens, Dubai could find itself building the most ambitious aviation project in history, just as the system it was designed for begins to break apart. So can Emirates survive a crisis like this? In the short term, the answer is almost certainly yes. The airline remains one of the most financially powerful carriers in the world, backed by the government of Dubai and supported by decades of investment in aircraft, infrastructure and global routes. But surviving the crisis doesn't mean returning to exactly the same model that existed before it. Because there is one factor Emirates can never change, and that's geography. Dubai will always sit at the crossroads between Europe, Asia, Africa and Australia, but it will also always sit inside a region where airspace can become politically unstable. And if those disruptions become more common, relying entirely on a single mega hub becomes a dangerous strategy. Which is why, quietly, Emirates has already begun changing something fundamental about its fleet. For most of its history, the airline relied on very large aircraft. The Airbus A380 and Boeing 777 allowed Emirates to funnel enormous numbers of passengers through Dubai, perfect for a hub-and-spoke network built around a single global crossroads. But the next generation of Emirates aircraft looks very different. The airline has ordered 73 Airbus A350-900s and up to 35 Boeing 787 Dreamliners, smaller, more efficient aircraft designed to fly longer routes with fewer passengers. That gives airlines far more flexibility to connect the cities directly without relying entirely on massive transfer hubs. And that flexibility may prove crucial, because the events of this crisis expose something uncomfortable about global aviation systems. Emirates' greatest advantage, its geography, can also become its greatest vulnerability. For decades, the airline thrived by exploiting the shortest paths across the map. But the future of Emirates may depend on something very different. The ability to operate in a world where the shortest path across the sky isn't always available. If you did enjoy this video, please remember to subscribe. I'm trying to reach 10,000 subscribers, and I make breakdowns like this almost every week. Thank you.